Ahoy! The musket was supposed to be nerfed last patch, and that nerf actually turned out to be a buff. Because of that, the musket is getting a second round of nerfs now in the new patch on PTR. However, unfortunately it looks like that one may end up being a buff too, at least part of it. XR and I once again grabbed our muskets and shot each other many times to see what these damage changes really mean. The first change or nerf that we need to talk about here is the damage falloff, which has been adjusted. The statement in the patch notes is adjusted the musket damage falloff to reduce the damage by 60% at the full 125 meters and 30% with the ballistic advantage passive. This is increased from the previous 37.5% and 18.75% with ballistic advantage. And now that you've seen these numbers, immediately forget them because that's definitely not accurate. There is nowhere near 60% damage falloff at any point with any build variation. I can only guess that this was some form of miscommunication and maybe they meant a reduction to 60% of the damage, but either way, here are the actual damage output numbers. This is what XR tested a little bit ago on the live client. These are the current damage values. If you watched my last video about this, they should already look familiar. There's no damage falloff between 0 and 50 meters, even if you have none of the passives active, and after that the damage slowly drops off, ending up at 61% of the damage at 125 meters, which is the longest range where enemies still have a hitbox most of the time. In contrast, here are the most recent values from this new patch. As you can see, generally the damage drop-off looks similar. We're keeping a little bit more damage. For example, at 60 meters we still have 95.7% of the damage instead of 92. But when we go down to 125 meters, then we have 63% of the damage left. So slightly more for some reason, but not really a major factor. But it definitely is a far cry from whatever number was suggested in the patch notes. However, things actually look better when we factor in the hit your mark passive. On the live client, this still entirely removes damage falloff, so your damage is always going to look the same no matter which distance. On the new version of the PTR, the damage drop-off here is actually more significant. In the last version, it ended up with 81.5% of the damage at 125 meters. Now we're looking at 71%, so a 10% reduction compared to the first patch. And this does line up with the 30% damage reduction from the patch notes, which is ultimately more important because any competent musket user is going to be using ballistic advantage. But what we also need to factor in is the change to hit your mark, which was not reverted. As a reminder, hit your mark increases the damage the further you are away from the target, with a maximum of 15% increase at 100 meters. On the live version, this only affects headshots and crits. On the PTR version, this affects all shots, including body shots that don't crit. And this is where trouble began on the last patch version, and it still begins here too. Because especially in combination with ballistic advantage, hit your mark just works directly against damage falloff now that it counts for every type of shot. And this is exactly what is still reflected in the damage values. Let's first look purely at body shots here. This is again the live damage for body shots because hit your mark doesn't affect your body shots on live unless you crit, whereas this is what we're now seeing on the newest patch on PTR. And as you can see, the damage is again higher. That's because you don't have any damage falloff until 50 meters, but you get the increase from the hit your mark passive now, which you didn't used to get on the previous patch on the live version. So at 50 meters at mid-range, you're dealing 106% weapon damage now. But even at 60 meters, you're still dealing 104% actually. At 70 meters, you're still dealing more than 100% weapon damage, and at 80 meters, you're just barely below it. It's only really past 90 meters that there's a slightly more significant falloff. But honestly, that by itself could be in the realms of what the devs intend for the musket. Obviously, they don't want the musket to be a close-range weapon, and they want it to be decent at mid-range to longer-ish ranges. They don't want too much falloff. I personally think that getting shot for almost full damage at 80 meters is kind of rough still, but it could just be the intended way. And if we compare it to the live values for a crit, you can take over the same percentages because the crit values would just multiply everything by the same amount. Then you can see that previously the crit values went much higher at very high ranges, where you would normally not crit, so it doesn't really matter. But you could see that, for example, if you hit a headshot at 70 meters, you would then deal 109% of the base weapon damage, whereas now you're dealing 100%. But as you can tell, the train is not stopping here. There are more things to consider. Let's keep the same things that we already tested, the ballistic advantage and the hit your mark passive active, but on top of that, let's slot an elemental gem into a weapon, because that's what every musket player does anyways. And on the topic of things that musket players do anyways, let's also add an elemental attunement. This one won't make a massive difference, but since every competent musket player uses it, why not? Now the first very interesting thing you'll notice here is that when we split the damage by the physical damage that we're dealing and the elemental damage that we're dealing, the physical damage goes down with range, but the elemental damage actually only goes up. It doesn't have any drop-off. Elemental gems are not affected by the damage drop-off at all. At the same time, hit your mark, which previously only affected crit damage, now affects base damage. And because it affects base damage, it also affects our elemental damage from the int gem, which scales with our base damage. And guess what also scales with the same base damage increase from hit your mark? Yep, our attunement. And suddenly things look very different. Our base multiplier here at 0 distance is all of this damage added together, physical damage, our elemental damage, and our attunement. Everything else is just what goes up based on range. And suddenly, we're not really dropping that low anymore. The lowest damage that we reach at this point is 98.8% of the damage on a body shot at 125 meters. Basically, no damage drop-off at all. In the range between 30 to 100 meters, we actually have fairly significant damage increases all around. That most certainly doesn't look like a significant reduction to the long-range damage of the musket. And if you want to push it even further and you want to include a best-in-slot musket here, you can also add Keenly Jagged. With just 2 ticks of Keenly Jagged, so basically what you're getting when firing at a target multiple times most of the time, you get over 100% damage at any range. So if you're lucky enough to have a best-in-slot musket, you're just getting buffed all around. At this point, even our headshot damage is pretty much the same as on the old patch with hit your mark up till 70 meters. Then it gradually gets lower, but every body shot still deals more damage. And again, at those very long ranges, you're looking at body shots, not headshots. No one is gonna do reliable headshots at 120 plus meters. In case you're interested, XR also included the version with the 150 int perk for good measure. This doesn't really change the numbers at all, it's just so that you see the difference in damage values, because this multiplier affects everything from 0 meters to 125 anyways. But this nerf is only the first part. There's also an issue that was fixed, where the shooter stance wasn't always going on cooldown properly, so can't be reused, but more importantly, the functionality of empowering shooter stance was updated. In the live version of the game, when slotted on armor, empowering shooter stance gives you a 23% empower when hitting a target while in shooter stance. According to the description, it has a 3-second duration, even though that's apparently longer as well. You could even cancel out of the shooter stance after a single shot, and you would still keep this empower for the duration for your other shots. That is no longer the case in the newest version of the PTR. Instead, hitting a target while having this slotted on armor gives you a 9.7% empower for 6 seconds. And this one stacks. With every shot that you land on a target while in shooter stance, you get an additional 9.7% empower. And this has a maximum of 4 shots, so technically you can reach almost 40% empower with this. But you have to keep in mind that in order to achieve this, every single shot needs to be landed. Only under absolutely ideal circumstances will you reach the same damage during shooter stance as you did on the previous patch. Miss a single shot and that opportunity is already gone, and that could just be from the enemy dodging. This makes you as the musket user also have to decide if you're gonna go for the guaranteed extra increase from the body shot or try for the headshot and take the higher risk of missing the shot and then also losing the empower. And most importantly, while the duration of the buff is increased to 6 seconds, you are going to lose this buff the moment you exit shooter stance. That is a massive trade-off. You can't quick cancel after a single shot anymore, and also if you get pressured at all while in shooter stance and you have to move, then you have to immediately sacrifice the empower as well. And keep in mind that in the first PTR patch we already saw buffs to the mobility while using sticky bomb as well as power shot and powder burn, so they definitely want musket players to be moving around more and punish them for sitting in one place for too long, or at least make the risk higher while doing so and the reward lower. Generally speaking, it seems like the empowering shooter stance nerf will actually have a more significant impact on the musket meta in general than the changes to the damage falloff will if they're going through the way they are right now. XI has already reported this to the community team again, so they are aware of the current situation. Of course, if you'd like to, you can contribute on the PTR forums as well, but keep in mind that this is always just a testing ground, so be nice about it. They're not intending for things to happen the way they do. I think it's just that a lot of tech behind New World is very complicated and not easy to solve. Especially things like the in-gem falloff can't just be switched around from one moment to the other. On the topic of complicated things, my advanced greatsword guide, part 1 I guess, will release tomorrow, so if you're interested in that, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell. We also have more changes to talk about and test on the PTR, so that is something that will be coming soon too. Hope to see you there, thanks for watching, Dukesloth, out.